Welcome to Lesson 7 of the course, Cooperative Individualism, the Third Way to the Just Society. The title of this lesson is Henry George's Influence on the Remnant. A group of intellectuals and some political activists who fully absorbed what Henry George provided in his writings saw in his proposals the means by which the justifications for a strong central government could be greatly reduced. They viewed the state as an instrument too often on the side of monopoly privilege and despotism. They accepted a limited role for government, allowing liberty to blossom, nurtured by cooperative individualism. When I first began to study the works of Henry George in 1980 at the Philadelphia extension of the Henry George School of Social Science, I wondered how this remarkable social philosopher had to that point escaped my attention. That same year, I was invited to participate in several events held at the school's main location in New York City. And there I met some of the surviving members of the old right who had devoted their lives to keeping alive what they understood to be the principles embraced by Henry George. The most scholarly of this remnant group was the Ukraine-born Jack Schwartzman, whose family escaped to the United States during the early years of the Bolshevik regime. Jack earned a law degree, then went on to earn a doctorate in literature and teach at a local college until well into his 70s. His book, Rebels of Individualism, published in 1949, included chapters on Thomas Paine and Henry George. At a conference held in 1979 to celebrate the centenary of Henry George's book Progress and Poverty, he stated, "To abolish poverty and to bridge the gap between affluence and misery, one must return to the universal guidelines of justice. The law of human progress. What is it but the moral law? Just as social adjustments promote justice, just as they acknowledge the equality of right between man and man, just as they ensure to each the perfect liberty which is bounded only by the equal liberty of every other, must civilization advance. Just as they fail at this, must advancing civilization come to a halt and recede." Jack Schwartzman had been a student in the late 1930s of a New York individualist named Frank Chodoroff, who had studied and absorbed Henry George's works in the decade between 1910 and 1920. By the early 1930s, he was writing for the single-text journal Land and Freedom on a regular basis, and later took over as director of the Henry George School of Social Science in New York City. From Henry George, Chodoroff acquired a full understanding that the enemy of cooperation between people was monopoly privilege, and he concluded that giving the power to government to mitigate monopoly had serious negative consequences. In civilization, therefore, man must satisfy his desires. But in what kind of civilization does he thrive, economically and spiritually, where the results of his efforts can be exchanged freely with those of other workers, without hindrance from monopoly, without exactions from the state, without interference from officialdom? Cooperation with his fellow man and the striving for mutual satisfactions is necessary, but only voluntary economic cooperation can achieve the desired result. Any political attempt to direct cooperation must be circumscribed by the mentality of the director. And since omniscience is not a human quality, it is obvious that direction must limit the scope of man's satisfactions. For that very reason, duress is a necessary corollary of direction, and duress is not freedom. Chodoroff, a pacifist, was dismissed as director of the Henry George School by a board concerned about his outspoken opposition to U.S. involvement in what, until the end of 1941, was a European war. When the U.S. finally entered the war, Chodoroff raised concerns about the future. Perhaps it is inevitable that for the time being that ideals be suspended. The danger is in their being forgotten. Ideals do not live in a vacuum. They are born, developed, and are retained in the human mind. They are recorded on the tablets of memory, and the peril is that in drifting into a reasonably comfortable existence in a world of violence, we may wipe the tablets clean, for one sleeps better when one strives for less. But there will be a tomorrow. There will always be a tomorrow, and it is the burden of those in whose memories the values of liberty and justice are deeply engraved to preserve the tablets for that tomorrow. Both of the above quotes come from articles Shotteroff wrote for The Freeman, a journal founded by Francis and Helen Nielsen in 1920 and edited by Francis Nielsen and Albert J. Nock. Francis Nielsen had achieved a certain level of fame in his native England when, while a member of Parliament, he wrote the anti-war tract How Diplomats Make War. In 1915, he resigned his seat in the House of Commons and came to the United States on a speaking tour sponsored by anti-war groups. He later recalled his introduction to Lincoln Steffens and a number of New Yorkers who came out of the single tax community. I spoke at a meeting in New York late in the autumn of 1916. Several single taxers came to hear what I had to say about the war and my ideas of a United States for Europe. When the meeting was over, I was introduced to Lincoln Steffens. His name and some of his published works were well known to me, for both Brand Whitlock and Albert J. Nock had repeatedly spoken to me about him. As the world's imperialists lurched toward another horrific bloodletting, Nielsen put his considerable analytical talents to work on a major effort to provide thoughtful people with a comprehensive path toward peace and widespread prosperity. His book, Man at the Crossroads, was published in 1938. At the end of his extensive report on the problems faced by all societies, he raises and answers the question, what then must be done? Liberate all those who are concerned in production and industry. But how is this to be done? There is only one way, and that is to take those values that are created by the community for the use of government and abolish all taxes that fall upon wealth. The justice of this proposal should be apparent to all thinking people, for it is recognized that land value is created by the community. Therefore, each and every one is heir to that vast estate. The first run of The Freeman lasted until 1924. A new group of writers and editors resurrected the magazine in 1930 for a brief period. Then, in 1938, another effort was made to bring the magazine back to life, with Frank Shotteroff as publisher and Will Listner, an economics reporter for the New York Times, as editor. After Frank Shotteroff was discharged from his position as director of the Henry George School in 1942, a decision was made to cease publication of The Freeman and start a newspaper produced directly by the Henry George School. In 1939, Albert J. Nock took the time to write an assessment of Henry George. Nock described the result as, quote, a critical essay. He saw George as a man with a mission and capable of dispassionate philosophical insights. He wrote, one can account in a sentence for every puzzling and lamentable anomaly which his career presents. He had the mind of a philosopher, a philosophic mind surpassed in power but by one or two in his generation, and an expository faculty surpassed by none. But the temperament of a philosopher he never had. He was no Hegel, nor yet was he a Plato, born with a clear-headed sense for the appraisal of things as they are, unimpressionable and free from illusions. The renowned philosopher John Dewey had a very different opinion of Henry George. The fact that Henry George has an ardent group of disciples who have a practical program for reform of taxation has tended to obscure from the recognition by students of social theory that his is one of the great names among the world's social philosophers. It would require less than the fingers of the two hands to enumerate those who from Plato down rank with him. His clear intellectual insight into social conditions, his passionate feeling for the remediable ills from which humanity suffers, find their logical conclusion in his plan for liberating labor and capital from the shackles which now bind them. There have been economists of great repute who, in their pretension to be scientific, have ignored the most significant elements in human nature. There have been others who were emotionally stirred by social ills and who proposed glowing schemes of betterment, but who passed lightly over facts. It is the thorough fusion of insight into actual facts and forces, with recognition of their bearing upon what makes human life worth living, that constitutes Henry George one of the world's great social philosophers. As the United States fell deeper into the Great Depression, Dewey was invited by a New York radio station to give his views on how to pull the country out of its economic problems. His message was pure Henry George. What are the most evident sore spots of the present? The answer is clear: unemployment, extreme inequality in the distribution of the national income, enormous fixed charges in the way of interest on debts, a crazy, cumbrous, inequitable tax system that puts the burden on the consumer and the ultimate producer and lets off the parasites, exploiters, and the privileged, who ought to be relieved entirely of their gorged excess, very lightly. And indeed, in many cases, as in that of the tariff, pays them a premium for imposing a burden on honest industry and on the means of production. A vicious and incompetent banking system with billions of money, the hope for the future of millions of hard-working peoples still locked up, while the depositors lose their homes and walk the streets in vain. The greater part of our population in the nation of the earth most favored by nature still living either in slums or in homes without the improvements indispensable to a healthy and civilized life. Everybody recognizes that fact in the stock market orgy of our late boom days. Only a few realize the extent to which speculation in land is the source of many troubles of the farmer, the part it has played in loading banks and insurance companies with frozen assets and compelling the closing of thousands of banks, nor how the high rents, the unpayable mortgages, and the slums of the cities are connected with speculation in land values. As the world was braced for a Second World War, cooperative individualists met in New York to report on and discuss the state of the world. They would not meet again for 10 years. Prior to this international gathering in 1939, Joseph Dana Miller, the longtime editor of the movement's primary journals, the Single Tax Review and Land and Freedom, died. Over Miller's long journalistic career, he did all he could to make the case for systemic reforms that could change the course of history. In the philosophy of freedom is the germ of a new renaissance. Perhaps it is not too late to sound the tocsin call to the struggle that must be waged for liberty. Not merely is it material poverty that must be abolished, but that intellectual and spiritual poverty so plainly obvious in every social group, from the lowest to the highest. It is no mere pessimism that impels us to this picture of modern society. Not to recognize it is to walk blindfolded in a world where tragic things are happening and where no great voice is raised to call us back to reasonableness. The skies are very dark. All that has been promised by prophets and seers seems to have come to naught, and to it all, political economy as it is taught, religion as it is preached, statesmanship as practiced, seem to have no answer. Slowly, after the end of the Second World War in 1945, cooperative individualists regrouped. In New York City, a small group including Francis Nielsen and Will Listener began to meet regularly to discuss important philosophical and practical issues. Several of these sessions were devoted to a critical analysis of Arnold Toynbee's A Study of History, and Francis Nielsen wrote an extensive review of the 6 volumes. During the Second World War, the educational program of the Henry George School continued under the direction of a Canadian named Margaret Bateman. In early May of 1945, she delivered a talk over the radio on the conference being held in San Francisco to form the United Nations. If all members of the San Francisco conference would seriously consider the proposals of Henry George, they would understand exactly how the foundations of the social structure can be laid in justice for all nations, large and small. They would not fear inflation or immigration or mass unemployment. They would know that in a world society where a correct economic system was in effect, these questions would not present fearsome difficulties. Margaret Bateman returned to Canada after the war, and Robert Clancy, following his discharge from military service, was appointed director of the Henry George School. He faced many challenges, most importantly the desire of people to rebuild their lives rather than devote time and energy to investigating an alternative economic and social philosophy at a time when any negative commentary on the American system might be construed as leftist or communist. Henry George's daughter, Anna George DeMille, had served as president of the Board of Trustees of the school from 1934 until her death in 1947. In 1938, she greeted those who came to New York from around the world with a call to arms on behalf of the principles they all shared. Civilization at this moment is standing with back against wall facing destruction. Communism, Nazism, fascism have sprung out of the poverty that is the result of denying the natural law. They are the antithesis of democracy that stands for freedom, freedom of production and freedom of trade, as well as freedom of speech and press and religious expression. Democracy is a way of government, but freedom is a way of life. Anna George DeMille was succeeded by the founder of the Lincoln Electric Company, John C. Lincoln. He had come into the movement after hearing Henry George lecture in Cleveland, Ohio in 1889. In 1924, he was the Commonwealth Land Party's nominee for Vice President of the United States. Lincoln embraced the core principles of cooperative individualism. Our tax laws would make one think that it was a crime to add to wealth of the community or to increase employment, and that it was a praiseworthy thing to decrease employment by holding land out of use for speculative purposes. We must realize that land is provided by the Creator and that all His children have an equal right to a life use of an equal share. We must realize that wealth is the product of an individual or of groups of individuals, and that while the community does have the power to appropriate part of this wealth, it has no right to do so. By the time I was introduced to the writings of Henry George and some of the others highlighted thus far, the number of people around the globe actively working for the cause of cooperative individualism had fallen to perhaps no more than 400 or 500. Perhaps a few thousand people scattered around the globe remained on movement mailing lists. John C. Lincoln had died in 1959, and his plan for long-term foundation grant funding of educational work had been diverted by family members to establish the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy in 1974. This new institute abandoned any pretense of direct advocacy of Henry George's socio-political principles. The Henry George School survived in New York City, but primarily by the timely sale of its Manhattan locations and investment of the net gains into stocks and bonds. Although the elimination of much of the funding forced the Henry George School to close many of its extensions and cease funding to affiliates and individuals, an even greater challenge arose as people flocked into the local community colleges, business schools, and other skill development educational institutions. The Lincoln Institute provided what professionals sought from an educational institution. Fewer and fewer people were drawn into the classroom in search of answers to problems they had not previously believed existed. The Henry George birthplace in Philadelphia continued to offer courses using Henry George's books as texts, but the number of students who finished courses fell off year after year. The same decline occurred in New York, but from far higher numbers, and in San Francisco, Chicago, and Los Angeles. All other locations permanently closed by the early 1970s. When I met Robert Clancy in 1981, he was running the Henry George Institute, established a year or two after he was dismissed as director of the Henry George School as part of a failed effort to upgrade the school's curriculum by bringing in university professors to teach and conduct seminars. The Institute's board was selected from dues-paying members and offered correspondence courses as an early but effective form of distance learning. Robert Clancy devoted much of his life to the teaching of cooperative individualism as contained in the writings of Henry George. He was mild-mannered and very patient, even with those who discounted his contributions, which were significant and lasting. After completing the 3-course program on political economy offered at the Philadelphia extension of the Henry George School, I was invited by the extension director, George Collins, to become a member of the volunteer faculty. Teaching is one of the best ways to immerse oneself into serious and complex material. Within a few years, I felt comfortable that I fully understood what Henry George was teaching his readers, and I did my best to convey his principles and key observations to students in the classroom. Attending annual conferences with like-minded people helped to introduce me to the writings of a long list of thoughtful people going back many centuries and sparked me to engage in research and writing projects of my own. For a time, I served as co-editor of Equal Rights, the organ of the Henry George Foundation of America. I also contributed articles to Land and Liberty, published in London. In 1997, I decided to establish the School of Cooperative Individualism as an online education and outreach project that would bring together in one location not only the writings of cooperative individualists, but of anyone who contributed importantly to the social sciences. This project has continued to grow in scope and includes an encyclopedia on political economy as well as a biographical history of the Georgist movement. After completing research and assembling lecture notes for a course titled The Search for the Just Society, which I taught for several years, I began work on the major writing project of my life, which turned into a 3-volume study titled The Discovery of First Principles. The first 2 volumes were published. The third I made available online. Eventually, the first 2 volumes were also put online by Google Books. My own teaching and lecturing continues, and much of the material I have developed is available to be downloaded without any charge or restriction on the School of Cooperative Individualism website and on my personal YouTube channel. My work with the Henry George School continues as well as one of the hosts of the school's interview program, Smart Talk, and lectures on a broad range of subjects. And with that, we've reached the end of Lesson 7.